Right there?
Yeah, he's very good.
This is Manuel Tomas Guillen. In 2024, he was living in Carlsbad, New Mexico, with his girlfriend, Brianna Ariel Stallings. Brianna was 25 years old. Manuel was 32. Inside that home was Brianna's baby daughter. For a while, nothing seemed outwardly alarming. There were no public reports, no visible emergency, no immediate search effort that drew attention from the neighborhood. The baby was simply no longer being seen. When family members asked about her, they were told she was staying with someone else. Later, the explanation changed. Then it changed again. Each answer sounded temporary, casual, almost routine. But over time, those answers began to contradict each other, and the inconsistencies grew harder to ignore. Relatives kept asking the same question: where is she? Months later, investigators would travel to a remote area along Queens Highway in Eddy County. What they uncovered there confirmed what some had already begun to fear. The baby had not been staying with relatives. She had been buried. By the time authorities reached that stretch of land, the story being told inside the Carlsbad home had already begun to collapse. Statements did not align. Timelines did not make sense. Details shifted depending on who was asking. What began as uncertainty slowly turned into suspicion, and suspicion eventually led to a criminal investigation that would focus directly on the two adults who had been responsible for the child. But the most unsettling part of this case is not just the discovery itself. It is how long the silence lasted before anyone outside that house knew the truth. Because the baby did not disappear in a dramatic way. There was no public alarm at first. There was only a gradual realization that something was missing. And once investigators began looking closer, the explanations that had once sounded harmless started to unravel under scrutiny. To understand how a missing baby in Carlsbad became the center of a burial investigation in Eddy County, we have to go back to the beginning, to the relationship between Brianna Stallings and Manuel Tomas Guillen, to the environment inside that home, and to the early signs that were easy to dismiss at the time. In the months before anyone contacted law enforcement, the situation inside the Carlsbad home appeared, at least on the surface, manageable. Brianna Ariel Stallings was the baby's mother, and Manuel Tomas Guillen was her boyfriend. They were living together in southeastern New Mexico, sharing responsibilities inside a household that included a baby who depended entirely on them. Family members did not initially assume something catastrophic had occurred. When they asked about the baby and were told she was staying elsewhere, the explanation did not immediately raise alarm. Temporary childcare arrangements are common, and distance between relatives can delay in-person confirmation. What caused concern was not a single answer, but the gradual pattern that developed afterward. The location of the baby changed depending on who was asking. One relative was told she was with extended family. Another was told she was spending time somewhere else. The explanations were casual, almost dismissive, and lacked specific details such as dates, addresses, or plans for her return. Over time, relatives began comparing what they had been told, and the inconsistencies became obvious. Weeks passed. No photographs were shared. No visits occurred. No clear timeline was provided for when the child would be seen again. At some point, concern shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The people asking about her could not reconcile the conflicting answers, and they began pressing for something concrete. When pressure increased, so did the vagueness of the responses. Instead of clarity, there were delays. Instead of reassurance, there were deflections. Eventually, family members reached a point where the explanations no longer seemed credible, and that is when authorities were contacted. Once law enforcement became involved, the tone of the situation changed immediately.
Annie, hey Brianna, are you talking
Yeah.
for me? You guys know why I'm out here trying to talk to you.
What had been informal family questioning became recorded interviews. Detectives asked for precise timelines. They wanted to know when the baby had last been physically seen, who had been present, and who had been responsible for her care at that time. the answers were not consistent. Investigators noted discrepancies in dates. Statements about the child's whereabouts did not align with one another. Basic details that should have been simple to confirm required repeated clarification. The longer the questioning continued, the clearer it became that no one outside the home had seen the baby for an extended period. Detectives then focused on the last confirmed sighting. They worked backward from that point, identifying when relatives could definitively say the child had been alive and physically present. That window narrowed the timeline considerably. If the baby had not been seen for months, then whatever had happened occurred well before anyone officially reported concern. Attention centered on the household. Brianna Stallings and Manuel Tomas Guillen were the two adults who had daily access to the child. Investigators examined their accounts carefully, comparing each statement for contradictions. Subtle differences in wording became important. Small changes in dates became significant. When pressed for specifics, the explanations became less detailed rather than more. As the inquiry deepened, detectives sought physical evidence that could either confirm or contradict what they were being told. They evaluated the home environment, looking for indications of recent occupancy by a baby. Items associated with the childcare were assessed. The absence of certain expected signs raised additional questions. At this stage, there was still no public confirmation of death. Officially, the child was considered missing. However, the direction of the investigation suggested that authorities were no longer operating under the assumption that she was simply staying elsewhere. The turning point came when one of the adults provided information that shifted the focus outside the house. Investigators were directed toward a remote area along Queens Highway in Eddy County, a stretch of land far removed from residential streets and daily activity. The location was isolated enough that anything placed there intentionally would likely remain undiscovered without specific guidance. Law enforcement organized a search. The area was methodically examined, and before long, evidence was located beneath the surface. What was uncovered confirmed that the baby had not disappeared through neglect or misplacement. She had been deliberately concealed. The discovery transformed the case immediately. What had been a missing child investigation became a death investigation, and with that change came a sharper focus on accountability. Forensic analysis followed. The remains were transported for examination, and investigators awaited results that would clarify not only the identity of the child, but the circumstances surrounding her death. While those results were pending, detectives returned to interviews, this time confronting the adults with the fact that the burial site had been located. When confronted with evidence, statements began to change. Earlier explanations about the baby being with relatives could no longer be maintained. The narrative shifted toward claims of an accidental death. One account suggested the child had been suffocated unintentionally while sleeping. Another version included references to drug use inside the home at the time of the incident. Each new statement attempted to explain not only the death, but the decision to bury the body rather than report it. Investigators did not rely solely on these explanations. They waited for medical findings. The autopsy revealed injuries that complicated the narrative of an accidental suffocation. The presence of fractured ribs and fentanyl in the child's system raised serious questions about the environment in which she had been living and the actions taken in her final hours. These findings directly contradicted any suggestion that the death had been a simple tragedy followed by panic. At this point, the case no longer revolved around where the baby was. It revolved around how she died and who was responsible. As evidence accumulated, the focus narrowed fully on Brianna Stallings and Manuel Tomas Guillen. The contradictions in their early statements, the concealment of the body, and the forensic findings combined to form the basis for criminal charges. Inside the Carlsbad home, life appeared ordinary to neighbors and casual visitors. Brianna Stallings and Manuel Tomas Guillen maintained a presence that gave the impression of routine domestic life. Manuel worked sporadically while Brianna handled childcare and household management. On the surface, there was nothing to suggest that a crisis was unfolding, and yet, the reality within the walls of that home was far more complicated than it appeared. The baby at the center of this story depended entirely on the two adults who were supposed to protect her. Early in her life, she had been healthy, developing normally, and receiving attention from her mother. Manuel Guillen's interactions with the child were inconsistent. He was present at times and absent at others, and those who observed him could not detect any outward signs of danger. But investigators later learned that his behavior was not always predictable or controlled. Brianna Stallings, meanwhile, faced the challenges of caring for a baby, while also managing her relationship with Manuel. Their household included moments of normal parenting, alongside periods of tension and instability. Friends and neighbors would later describe Brianna as attentive in public settings, but investigators discovered that inside the home, the environment could be chaotic and unpredictable. In the months leading up to the baby's disappearance from public view, there were small but telling signs that something was amiss. The child was rarely seen outside the home, and visits from relatives became irregular. When family members attempted to check in or request updates, they were met with vague or changing explanations. One day the baby was said to be with a relative. Another day she was described as being cared for elsewhere. Investigators would later determine that these inconsistencies were not accidental. They served to delay attention, to reduce the likelihood that someone outside the household would notice any immediate threat or danger. On the evening of the critical incident, both Brianna and Manuel were in the home with the baby. According to later statements, the baby's death occurred during a period when both adults were reportedly under the influence of drugs. Investigators learned that fentanyl had been present in the household, and toxicology later confirmed traces in the baby's system. These details suggested that the child's vulnerability was exacerbated by the environment in which she was living. After the death, the adults faced a choice. The decision was made to conceal the body rather than notify authorities. Over the course of the following days and weeks, both attempted to maintain explanations about the child's absence that would prevent suspicion. They told family members that the baby was elsewhere, relying on the assumption that the extended family would not be able to verify the child's location immediately. The concealment was methodical in its simplicity. The remains were placed in a location outside the home, away from areas of frequent passage, and the adults maintained a consistent narrative with outsiders to prevent discovery. Investigators later noted that the absence of immediate public concern, combined with shifting explanations, allowed the child's remains to remain undiscovered for months. During this time, family members repeatedly attempted to locate the baby. They made inquiries about her schedule, her location, and her care. Each question was met with answers that were either incomplete or inconsistent, further delaying any realization that something had gone terribly wrong. By the time authorities were formally contacted, the timeline of the child's absence had already extended over a period long enough that investigators immediately recognized the case as more than a simple missing child report. It had evolved into a suspected death investigation, requiring careful reconstruction of events and precise identification of responsible parties. Detectives began reviewing all interactions, statements, and accounts from the adults who had been closest to the child. They noted discrepancies in the timelines, contradictions in the reported whereabouts of the baby, and shifting explanations about who had been in charge of her care. These inconsistencies became critical evidence, as they suggested both deliberate concealment and attempts to manipulate the narrative presented to relatives and investigators. The environment in which the child had lived, combined with the toxicology findings, the inconsistent statements, and the delays in reporting, created a clear picture for investigators. The baby had been placed in an environment where her safety was compromised, and following her death, the actions taken by the adults were focused on concealment rather than accountability. By reconstructing the timeline, law enforcement could identify the window in which the death occurred, the decisions made immediately afterward, and the methods used to hide the body. This reconstruction would later prove crucial in securing arrest warrants and moving toward formal charges. The next step in the case involved locating the burial site, which required both cooperation from one of the adults and a methodical search in a remote area. It was only when investigators reached this point that the full gravity of the case became apparent, and the chain of events that began in the Carlsbad home was made tangible through physical evidence. Months after the baby had last been seen, law enforcement finally narrowed their focus to the adults who had been responsible for her care. Brianna Stallings, the mother, and Manuel her boyfriend, became the main suspects. Investigators reviewed their statements and noticed clear contradictions. They also began to piece together timelines and check physical evidence that could confirm where the child had been during the weeks she was missing. Family members, including the baby's grandfather, had been asking about her for weeks. He had grown concerned when he could not see the child and when explanations about her location kept changing. At home, the grandfather had no idea that the baby's remains were buried just a short distance away. His questions, persistent as they were, had been met with answers that hid the truth, and he remained unaware of the full situation until investigators revealed it. Investigators eventually located the burial site along Queens Highway in Eddy County. The body of the infant was found buried in the desert soil, confirming the worst fears of family and law enforcement alike. The case shocked the local community. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of a normal household with the reality of what had happened. The grandfather, who had repeatedly asked about the baby and trusted those closest to her, had unknowingly been near the scene the entire time, never imagining the truth of her death. Eventually, both adults faced charges related to the death of the infant and the concealment of her body. If you found this story important, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. More stories like this are coming, and your support helps bring attention to cases that deserve to be remembered.